Anger is not just an emotion that appears out of nowhere. It begins deep within the brain, specifically in a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. The amygdala plays a crucial role in how we experience and respond to emotions, particularly those linked to survival, such as fear and anger. It acts like an emotional alarm system, scanning every situation for possible threats and deciding whether to trigger a reaction. When the amygdala senses danger, whether it's a physical threat or a perceived emotional one like criticism or disrespect, it reacts instantly, long before the logical part of the brain has time to evaluate the situation. This rapid response is what makes anger feel so sudden and overwhelming. Once the amygdala detects a threat, it sends distress signals to another part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Functions like a control center that communicates with the rest of the body through the autonomic nervous system. It immediately releases stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. These chemicals prepare the body for action by increasing heart rate, raising blood pressure, and sharpening alertness. This chain reaction is known as the fight or flight response, an ancient survival mechanism designed to help humans either confront danger or escape it. In modern life, however, most triggers are not physical dangers but psychological ones: arguments, traffic jams, or work stress. Yet the amygdala doesn't distinguish between real threats and emotional discomfort. It reacts the same way. When someone cuts you off in traffic, for example, the amygdala interprets it as a form of attack. It sets off the same biochemical storm as if you were facing a wild animal. The adrenaline rush you feel in that moment is your body preparing for battle. Your breathing quickens, your muscles tighten, and your focus narrows. The entire body shifts into survival mode because the amygdala has sounded the alarm. This rapid response once helped early humans stay alive, but in today's world it often causes overreactions. Since our modern stressors rarely require physical defense, the body's preparation for combat can manifest as irritability, shouting, or impulsive behavior. Essentially, the amygdala hijacks rational thought, causing people to act on emotion rather than reason. The logical part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is momentarily bypassed. This is why in moments of anger, people often say or do things they later regret. The amygdala acts first and asks questions later. The amygdala is extremely sensitive and can be easily triggered when a person is under chronic stress, lacking sleep, or feeling emotionally drained. Over time, repeated exposure to stress hormones can make the amygdala even more reactive. Scientists have found that in individuals who experience frequent anger or anxiety, the amygdala tends to be overactive. This overactivity means that even minor frustrations can be perceived as serious threats, leading to exaggerated emotional responses. When this pattern continues, it creates a cycle in which anger becomes easier to trigger and harder to control. The role of the amygdala in anger also explains why controlling anger is difficult. The process begins before conscious awareness kicks in. The brain's automatic reaction happens in milliseconds, while the reasoning part takes longer to process the situation. Therefore, the body is already primed for aggression before logic has the chance to intervene. The amygdala's primary concern is survival, not diplomacy, which is why its signals can overpower rational thinking in heated moments. Despite this, the amygdala's response is not entirely negative. It plays an essential role in keeping humans alert, aware, and ready to act when genuine threats arise. The challenge lies in understanding and managing when this system is overreacting. By learning to recognize the physical signs of an amygdala-driven reaction, like a racing heartbeat or clenched fists, individuals can start to pause before responding. Practices such as deep breathing and mindfulness can help calm the amygdala and re-engage the rational brain, allowing for more thoughtful responses instead of impulsive anger. The first step toward mastering anger is realizing that it begins not in character or personality, but deep within the brain's emotional circuitry, where the amygdala silently controls how we perceive and react to the world around us. The prefrontal cortex is one of the most important parts of the story. Brain, when it comes to managing emotions, decision-making, and self-control, it acts as the rational and logical counterbalance to the amygdala, the emotional center that triggers anger and fear. While the amygdala reacts quickly and automatically to perceived threats, the prefrontal cortex steps in to evaluate whether those threats are real or exaggerated. It helps us think before we act, control impulses, and respond in a socially acceptable way. In a well-balanced brain, the prefrontal cortex keeps the amygdala's impulses in check, preventing unnecessary anger or overreaction. However, when stress, fatigue, or hunger enter the picture, this balance is disrupted, and the ability of the prefrontal cortex to regulate emotions weakens dramatically. When the brain experiences prolonged stress, cortisol levels remain elevated. This hormone, while helpful in short bursts, can interfere with the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. Chronic exposure to stress hormones reduces activity in this region, making it harder to think clearly, focus, or make rational decisions. At the same time, the amygdala becomes more sensitive and overactive. This combination, a weakened prefrontal cortex and an overstimulated amygdala, creates the perfect conditions for irritability and anger. It is why small inconveniences can feel overwhelming when you're under pressure or exhausted. The logical part of the brain that usually tells you to calm down or let it go becomes less effective, and emotions start to take control. Sleep deprivation has a similar effect. Studies using brain imaging show that when people don't get enough sleep, the communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala breaks down. In a well-rested brain, the prefrontal cortex can dampen the emotional outbursts of the amygdala. But when you are tired, this connection weakens, leaving the amygdala free to overreact. That's why a lack of sleep often leads to irritability, impulsive decisions, and a lower tolerance for frustration. Even minor challenges like waiting in line or dealing with slow technology can feel intolerable because your emotional regulation system is compromised. Hunger is another powerful disruptor. The brain relies on glucose for energy, and when blood sugar drops, the prefrontal cortex is one of the first areas to lose efficiency. This explains the term a hangry, where hunger-induced irritability takes over. When the brain's rational control center doesn't have enough fuel, emotional impulses become stronger. A person may snap, yell, or become impatient over trivial matters simply because the brain is deprived of energy. In this state, the amygdala dominates and logical reasoning fades into the background. Stress, lack of sleep, and poor nutrition create a dangerous pattern. Over time, they train the brain to react emotionally instead of thoughtfully. When the prefrontal cortex remains underactive for long periods, it becomes less capable of calming the amygdala, and this imbalance can lead to chronic irritability or anger issues. This is why people under constant stress, whether from work, relationships, or personal struggles, tend to be more reactive. Their emotional control systems are physically and chemically weakened, leaving them vulnerable to outbursts that seem out of proportion to the situation. However, the brain is not fixed. The prefrontal cortex can be strengthened just like a muscle through consistent practice. Mindfulness meditation, for instance, has been shown to increase gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex, improving its ability to regulate emotions. Deep breathing exercises help slow down the physiological responses triggered by the amygdala, giving the prefrontal cortex time to regain control. Regular physical activity also promotes better communication between brain regions and helps restore hormonal balance. Proper rest and balanced nutrition provide the brain with the energy it needs to maintain emotional stability. When people understand how the prefrontal cortex functions, they begin to see anger differently. Not as a flaw in personality, but as a moment when the brain's control system is overwhelmed. Strengthening this part of the brain allows individuals to pause, reflect, and respond more calmly, even in stressful situations. The ability to stay composed under pressure depends on how well the prefrontal cortex can keep the amygdala's impulses under control. When this connection is strong, the brain operates in harmony, emotions remain balanced, and irritability fades when anger becomes a repeated reaction. It begins to shape the brain itself. Every time you respond with frustration or rage, the neural circuits responsible for that emotion become stronger. The brain works much like a muscle. What you use often becomes more developed. This process, known as neuroplasticity, allows the brain to form new pathways and reinforce existing ones based on repeated behavior. In the case of anger, the more frequently you react with irritation, the more efficiently your brain learns to trigger that emotion. Over time, anger stops being just a temporary response and turns into a habitual state of mind. What was once an occasional reaction to stress becomes your brain's automatic way of dealing with even minor inconveniences. When a person experiences anger, the amygdala activates, sending distress signals that flood the body with adrenaline and cortisol. The prefrontal cortex is supposed to regulate this response by analyzing whether the threat is real or exaggerated. But when anger becomes frequent, the amygdala grows more dominant while the prefrontal cortex loses influence. This imbalance means that your brain starts defaulting to anger without much rational thought. The emotional circuits become so practiced that they bypass logic altogether. Essentially, the brain becomes wired for emotional quick reactions instead of thoughtful responses. This is why people who are often angry tend to react explosively even when the situation doesn't warrant such intensity. Their brains have learned to overreact. The repeated release of stress hormones not only changes how the brain functions, but can also alter its structure. Studies have shown that chronic anger and stress can enlarge the amygdala, making it even more reactive, while at the same time shrinking parts of the prefrontal cortex that are involved in impulse control and decision-making. This physical change in the brain reinforces the emotional imbalance, creating a loop that sustains irritability and aggression. The more often a person engages in angry behavior, the easier it becomes for the brain to fall back into that pattern. This neurological cycle explains why anger problems rarely resolve on their own. They become embedded in the brain's wiring. In daily life, this can manifest as a low tolerance for frustration, impatience, and constant irritability. For example, someone who gets angry frequently at work may find themselves snapping at family members at home without realizing it. The brain, having practiced anger repeatedly, generalizes the response to other areas of life. It becomes the default emotional reaction to any discomfort, whether the problem is big or small. This is not because the person wants to be angry, but because their brain has been trained to react that well-worn path in a forest. The anger circuit becomes the easiest route for the brain to take. However, just as the brain can learn anger, it can also unlearn it. The same neuroplasticity that strengthens anger circuits can be used to build new, calmer pathways. Each time you choose to respond with patience instead of irritation, the brain forms and reinforces a different neural route. Over time, this alternative pathway becomes stronger and the brain begins to favor it. This is why techniques like mindfulness, cognitive reframing, and emotional awareness are effective. They literally change the brain's wiring. Practicing calm responses weakens the old anger circuits and builds new connections associated with self-control and emotional stability. This process takes time and consistency because the brain needs repeated exposure to new patterns before they become automatic. Every moment of awareness, every deep breath before reacting, and every decision to let go of small frustrations helps reshape the brain. It's like exercising a new muscle. At first, it feels unnatural and effortful, but with practice, it becomes second nature. In this way, anger is not just a personality trait, but a learned neurological habit that can be unlearned through conscious effort. The mind's ability to rewire itself means that even deeply ingrained irritability can be transformed into calmness. With persistence, the emotional circuits of the brain can shift from reactivity to resilience, allowing a person to experience peace where they once felt constant tension. The chemistry of the brain plays a crucial role in how we experience and manage anger. While emotions might seem purely psychological, they are actually deeply influenced by the balance of neurotransmitters that transmit signals between nerve cells. Among these, serotonin stands out as one of the most important in regulating mood and emotional stability. When serotonin levels are balanced, it helps keep the amygdala calm, allowing the prefrontal cortex to maintain control over emotional impulses. However, when serotonin levels drop, irritability and aggression tend to increase. This is why people with low serotonin often struggle with emotional regulation, becoming more prone to frustration, impatience, and anger, even over small inconveniences. Serotonin acts as a natural mood stabilizer. It promotes feelings of well-being, calmness, and emotional clarity. When levels are low, the brain's emotional response becomes unbalanced. The amygdala becomes more reactive, while communication between emotional and logical brain regions weakens. As a result, the threshold for anger lowers. You start reacting faster and more intensely to triggers that normally wouldn't bother you. Research has shown that people who are chronically stressed, sleep-deprived, or have poor diets often have reduced serotonin activity. This makes them more sensitive to negative emotions and more likely to experience irritability. Essentially, the brain loses its chemical buffer that keeps emotions in check. Diet plays a significant role in maintaining serotonin balance. The brain produces serotonin from an amino acid called tryptophan, which is found in foods like eggs, salmon, nuts, cheese, and turkey. If your diet lacks these nutrients, serotonin synthesis decreases and mood regulation suffers. Refined sugars and processed foods can make this problem worse. They cause rapid spikes and crashes in blood sugar levels, which influence energy, concentration, and mood stability. After a sugar crash, cortisol levels rise, increasing stress and anger responses. In contrast, a diet rich in whole grains, proteins, and leafy greens helps sustain steady energy and promote a balanced emotional state. Sleep is another vital factor. During sleep, the brain restores neurotransmitter levels and clears out metabolic waste. When you don't sleep enough, serotonin production declines and stress hormones rise. This combination makes the brain more reactive and less capable of emotional control. Sleep deprivation also weakens the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, meaning the logical part of your brain loses its ability to regulate the emotional part. That's why even a small annoyance can feel overwhelming when you're tired. However, when anger becomes a constant emotional state, it ceases to serve a protective role and starts causing harm. Chronic anger keeps the body trapped in a state of stress. The continuous release of stress hormones damages blood vessels, raises blood pressure, and burdens the heart. Over time, it can weaken the immune system, disrupt digestion, and even affect memory and concentration. The brain's chemistry begins to change under the influence of long-term anger. The amygdala grows more reactive, while the prefrontal cortex, the part that manages impulse control and rational thought, becomes less active. This imbalance makes it easier to lose control and harder to calm down. Essentially, chronic anger reshapes the brain to favor aggression over reason. Mindfulness trains awareness. It allows one to notice the physical signs of anger, such as a racing heartbeat or tense muscles, before the emotion takes over completely. This awareness activates the prefrontal cortex, which helps regulate the amygdala's reaction.